Okay, let's get right into it. Today we're talking about one of those inventions that completely changed the board, gunpowder. It's just a simple mixture, really, but it quite literally exploded onto the world stage and reshaped, well, everything. Warfare, politics, you name it. And that's really the big question we're tackling, isn't it? How on earth did a handful of dusty powders, discovered by accident no less, end up being the thing that brought down impenetrable castles and totally ended the Age of Knights? You know, the recipe itself is almost laughably simple. You've got about 75% potassium nitrate, that's saltpeter, which is the key because it brings its own oxygen to the party. Then you mix in about 15% charcoal for fuel and a little 10% sulfur to help the whole thing catch fire and burn really fast. And that's it. 3 pretty common ingredients that gave humanity this incredible new power. So its original Chinese name was Hua Yao, which is awesome. It translates to fire medicine. And the science here is super interesting. Gunpowder doesn't detonate like, say, TNT. It deflagrates, which is just a fancy way of saying it burns extremely fast. And that super rapid burn creates a huge wave of hot expanding gas. It's that pressure, that sudden push, that fires a cannonball or makes things go boom. Okay, so how did this fire medicine get from some alchemist's lab into the hands of a conqueror? Let's follow its wild, explosive journey across the map. This timeline just lays it all out. I mean, it starts as this total accident in China, around 850. The people who found it were actually trying to make a potion for eternal life. Talk about irony. But it was the Mongol invasions in the 1200s that really spread the secret, a sort of brutal but super effective delivery service heading west. And then, 1453, that's the moment. That's when Mehmed II's massive cannons just shattered the supposedly unbreakable walls of Constantinople. And that sent a shockwave across the entire world. The message was clear. Your castle walls can't save you anymore. From then on, gunpowder was the foundation of every major military power for centuries. And this, right here, is the biggest takeaway. For 1,000 years, a knight in shining armor was the peak of military technology, but a knight means absolutely nothing against a musket ball. A high stone wall means nothing against a cannon. This wasn't just an upgrade in weapons, it was the total reset of society. Power wasn't about who had the strongest knights anymore. It was about which government could organize, tax its people, and mass-produce cannons and guns. This was the birth of the modern world, all kicked off by that simple black powder. But here's the thing. For all its world-changing power, gunpowder was kind of messy. It was far from a perfect material. It was revolutionary, for sure, but also really crude. So let's get into the science of it and see why it was both a miracle and a bit of a nightmare to work with. So on the one hand, its strengths were incredible for the time. Because it carries its own oxygen, you could pack it into the barrel of a gun and it would still burn. Genius. And it was easy to make tons of it. But the flip side, the flaws were huge. The thick black smoke it produced would just cover a battlefield, making it impossible to see anything. Total chaos. It was also a sponge for moisture, so if it got damp, it was useless. And to top it all off, the gunk it left behind would eat away at the metal of your cannons and guns. So yeah, these problems created a huge demand for something better. And, well, that search for something better eventually paid off. So where does that leave our original fire medicine today, here in 2026? Has it just become a footnote in history? When it comes to the military, yeah, pretty much. By the late 1800s, chemists had figured out smokeless powders and stable, high explosives like TNT. These new materials were way more powerful, way more reliable, and they didn't create that massive smoke cloud. The era of black powder on the battlefield was officially over. But it didn't just disappear. It just kind of retired. It found new, more specialized jobs. Today, its biggest gig by far is fireworks. It's what shoots them up into the sky and makes them explode in those big, beautiful patterns. Of course, it's essential for historical reenactments, special effects in movies, and it even sees a little action in some small mining operations. Its battlefield roar has basically become a celebratory pop. So that's the story. A material that completely rewrote the rules of the world and then sort of faded away. Now it's time to put it all together and give gunpowder its final official ranking. First up, the big one, historical impact. And this is a monster score, a 9.5 out of 10. I mean, you really can't argue with it. It brought an end to feudalism, it made the age of exploration possible, and it defined warfare for 500 years. An absolute top-tier game changer. But then we have to look at its lasting relevance, and here the score just tanks, a 5 out of 10. And that massive drop is really the core of why we're ranking it the way we are. Outside of fireworks and some hobbies, it's a museum piece. It was completely and totally outclassed by better technology. All right, let's look at the whole report card. That historical score is massive, obviously. Workability gets a really high 8.5 because it was so simple to whip up. But its mechanical properties are only a 7 because, it had all those flaws we talked about. And that low relevance score really drags the whole average down. And all of that brings us to our final verdict. Gunpowder is a solid B tier. It was unbelievably revolutionary, no question. But the reality is, it was also crude, dirty, and its time at the very top was actually pretty short before something better came along. It was an essential stepping stone, but it wasn't the final destination. You could say it lit the fuse of the modern world. And then, once the explosion happened, it just got left behind in the smoke. So I'll leave you with this final thought. Gunpowder took power away from the guy in the expensive armor and gave it to anyone who could hold a musket. In a way, it democratized violence. And that forces us to ask a really big question. What happens when a simple technology gives everyone the power to tear things down? Something to think about.